I never imagined that the people I trusted most would be the ones to destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. For 3 years since Michael's death, I've been asking questions that nobody wanted to answer. Questions about the night he died, about the insurance money that disappeared, about why his family suddenly became so protective of his memory. Everyone called me a grieving widow who couldn't let go. They said I was paranoid, delusional, that grief had made me lose touch with reality. But when that tape started playing in front of all of them, when Michael's own voice filled the room with words they never expected me to hear, their faces told me everything I needed to know. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of their carefully constructed lies crashing down around them. Before I continue with what that recording revealed, I need you to understand how we got here. How a woman who once trusted everyone around her became someone fighting for the truth about her own husband's death. It all started in the spring of 2019, when I was 32 and still believed that love could conquer anything. I met Michael at a bookstore cafe on a rainy Thursday afternoon. He was sitting alone at a corner table, reading Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms, and when he looked up and smiled at me, something in my chest fluttered like butterfly wings. His eyes were the color of autumn leaves, warm brown with flecks of gold that caught the afternoon light streaming through the cafe windows. When he asked if he could buy me coffee, his voice was gentle but confident, like someone who had learned to speak carefully but wasn't afraid of being heard. Our courtship unfolded like pages in a favorite book. Michael worked as an accountant for a mid-sized firm downtown, nothing glamorous but steady work that paid well enough for him to rent a small house in the suburbs. He drove a reliable Honda Civic that smelled like the vanilla air fresheners he bought in bulk from the dollar store. On our first date, he took me to an art museum and spent 2 hours listening to me talk about the brushstrokes in a Van Gogh painting, never once checking his phone or looking bored. That night, as he walked me to my car, he told me he could listen to me talk about anything for the rest of his life. We married 8 months later in his parents' backyard, under a white tent that flapped gently in the September breeze. His mother, Patricia, wore a navy blue dress that made her look stern and elegant, while his father, Robert, kept adjusting his tie and making jokes to hide his nervousness. Michael's younger sister, Carmen, served as our photographer, snapping candid shots that captured the joy I felt radiating from every pore of my body. I wore my grandmother's pearl necklace and my mother's wedding dress, altered to fit my smaller frame. The scent of Patricia's rose garden mixed with the aroma of BBQ chicken and potato salad, creating a sensory memory I thought would comfort me forever. The first 2 years of our marriage felt like living inside a warm embrace. Michael would wake me up with coffee every morning, made exactly the way I liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of cream, stirred clockwise exactly 12 times. He had this endearing habit of humming while he cooked dinner, usually off-key renditions of Beatles songs that made me laugh until my sides hurt. On Sunday mornings, we'd read the newspaper together in bed, passing sections back and forth while the smell of bacon drifted up from the kitchen where he'd set a timer to start cooking automatically. Our house was a modest 2-bedroom colonial with cream-colored walls and hardwood floors that creaked in all the right places. Michael had painted the living room walls himself, a warm shade of sage green that complemented the antique furniture his grandmother had left him. The kitchen windows faced east, flooding the breakfast nook with golden morning light that made even mundane Tuesday mornings feel special. We had plans to renovate the basement into an office where I could work on my freelance graphic design projects, and Michael had already started sketching layouts on graph paper he kept in a manila folder labeled Future Dreams. But happiness, I've learned, can be as fragile as morning frost. The first crack in our perfect life appeared when Michael started working late more frequently. At first, it seemed reasonable. Tax season stretched longer each year, and his firm had taken on several new corporate clients. But by November of our second year, he was coming home after 9 o'clock most nights, smelling like stale coffee, and sometimes something else I couldn't quite identify. When I asked about his day, his responses became shorter, more mechanical. Busy day, lots of numbers to crunch. Same old stuff. He'd kiss my forehead and disappear into the bathroom for long showers that lasted until the hot water ran out. The changes were subtle at first, like watching a photograph fade so slowly you don't notice until you compare it to the original. Michael's smile became tighter around the edges, his laughter less frequent and more forced. He stopped humming while cooking, stopped reading the Sunday paper in bed, stopped stop talking about our future basement office. When I tried to bring up vacation plans or weekend activities, he'd nod and agree, but his eyes would drift to his phone or out the window, as if his mind were somewhere else entirely. Christmas of 2020 was when I first noticed the secret starting to take root in our marriage. Michael had always been terrible at hiding presents. In previous years, I'd catch him shoving badly wrapped boxes under the bed or in the hall closet, grinning sheepishly when I pretended not to notice. But that year, there were no telltale signs of hidden gifts, no mysterious shopping bags, no credit card statements with redacted store names. When I asked about our usual Christmas Eve gift exchange, he seemed genuinely surprised, as if he'd forgotten we had traditions that mattered to me. Oh, right, Christmas. I've been so swamped at work, I totally lost track of the dates, he said, running his hand through hair that had started showing threads of premature gray near his temples. Maybe we could do something simple this year. Order takeout, watch a movie? The Michael I married would have already had my presents wrapped and hidden by Thanksgiving. The Michael I married would have remembered that Christmas Eve was the anniversary of our first kiss, outside that same museum where he'd listened to me talk about Van Gogh. This new Michael, the one standing in our kitchen avoiding my eyes, felt like a stranger wearing my husband's face. New Year's Eve brought the first of what I now recognize as the early warning signs. We were at his parents' house for their annual party, surrounded by family friends and neighbors I'd grown to love over the past 2 years. I was in the kitchen helping Patricia arrange cheese and crackers on serving platters when I overheard Robert and Michael having what sounded like an intense conversation in the den. Their voices were low, but I caught fragments that made my stomach clench. Can't keep this up much longer, and she's gonna figure it out, and you know what's at stake here. When I walked into the den to offer them appetizers, their conversation stopped so abruptly it was like someone had unplugged a radio mid-song. Michael's face flushed red from his neck to his hairline, and Robert suddenly became very interested in adjusting the logs in the fireplace. They both smiled at me with the kind of forced brightness people use when they're hiding something significant. "What were you two talking about?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light and curious rather than suspicious. "Just boring work stuff," Michael said quickly. Dad was asking about the Peterson account, but Robert worked in construction, had never shown any interest in accounting, and I'd never heard Michael mention any Peterson account before. The lie sat in the air between us like smoke from the fireplace, visible and acrid and impossible to ignore. Over the next few months, these incomplete conversations became a regular occurrence. I'd walk into rooms and find Michael on the phone, speaking in hushed tones that would immediately shift to normal volume when he noticed me. "Yeah, Mom, I'll ask Sarah about that recipe," he'd say, even though Patricia had never asked me for a recipe, and the conversation I'd partially heard had definitely not been about food. Phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room became so frequent that I started keeping a mental tally, wondering if I was losing my mind or if my husband really was hiding something significant from me. The missing photographs appeared sometime in March 2021. I first noticed it when I was dusting the living room bookshelf and realized that our wedding album was no longer in its usual spot between Michael's college yearbook and a collection of Stephen King novels. When I asked Michael about it, he claimed he'd moved it to the bedroom dresser for safekeeping, but when I checked, it wasn't there either. Over the next few weeks, other photos began disappearing. The framed picture of us on our honeymoon in Cape Cod, the candid shot Carmen had taken of us dancing at his cousin's wedding, even the simple snapshot I'd taken of Michael grilling burgers in our backyard last summer. "Maybe we should organize all our photos digitally," Michael suggested when I mentioned the missing pictures. "Physical photos take up so much space, and they can get damaged or lost." But I'd grown up in a house where photographs covered every surface, where my mother had taught me that physical pictures held emotions in a way that digital files never could. The missing photos felt like pieces of our history being systematically erased, and I couldn't understand why Michael seemed so eager to let them disappear. The rules started appearing around the same time as the missing photographs, spoken casually, but with an undertone of firmness that brooked no argument. "Don't answer the door if you're not expecting someone," Michael said one evening as he loosened his tie after work. "There have been some break-ins in the neighborhood, and I want you to be safe when I'm not here." But our neighborhood had always been quiet, family-oriented, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and children played in front yards until well after dark. When I checked the local police reports online, I found no recent break-ins, no warnings about suspicious activity. Another rule followed a week later. If anyone calls asking questions about me or my work, just tell them I'm not available and take a message. Some of our clients are really pushy about deadlines. The most puzzling rule came in April. Don't go in the basement anymore. I'm storing some confidential client files down there for security reasons, and I could get fired if anyone accesses them. He'd installed a new lock on the basement door, a heavy deadbolt that required a key I wasn't allowed to have. The basement that was supposed to become my office space was now off limits, transformed overnight from our shared future dream into a forbidden territory I wasn't permitted to enter. Each new rule felt reasonable when Michael explained it, but together they created a web of restrictions that made me feel like a guest in my own home. I found myself checking each room before entering, wondering if there were new areas I wasn't supposed to access, new conversations I wasn't supposed to overhear, new questions I wasn't supposed to ask. The personal item's disappearance was more subtle, but equally unsettling. My favorite coffee mug, a ceramic piece I'd bought on our honeymoon, vanished from the kitchen cabinet. My grandmother's antique jewelry box, which had sat on our bedroom dresser since we moved in, was suddenly absent from its spot. When I asked Michael about these missing items, he always had reasonable explanations. The mug had been accidentally broken and thrown away, the jewelry box had been moved to the closet for safekeeping, and he'd forgotten to mention it. But when I checked the closet, the jewelry box wasn't there, and I never found any evidence of my broken mug in the trash. The accumulation of these small mysteries created a constant, low-level anxiety that followed me through my daily routine. I started making mental inventories of our belongings, checking and rechecking the locations of important items, taking photos with my phone to prove to myself that certain objects had existed in our home. The paranoia felt ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that pieces of my life were being methodically removed when I wasn't paying attention. Then came the night that changed everything, the critical incident that would eventually lead me to that devastating tape recording. It was a humid Friday evening in late June 2021, the kind of night when the air conditioning couldn't quite keep up with the heat, and every movement felt sluggish and deliberate. Michael had called to say he'd be working late again, a phone call that had become so routine I barely reacted to the disappointment anymore. I ordered Chinese takeout and settled in to watch a movie, planning to save Michael's portion in the refrigerator for when he eventually came home. Around 10:30, I heard his car pull into the driveway, followed by the familiar sounds of his key in the front door and his briefcase hitting the floor in the entryway. But instead of coming to find me as he usually did, I heard him go directly to the basement door. The sound of the deadbolt turning was followed by his footsteps on the wooden stairs, descending into the space I was no longer allowed to enter. Curiosity gnawed at me like a persistent itch. What could possibly be so confidential that it required this level of secrecy? What kind of accounting files needed to be locked away from his own wife? After about 20 minutes, unable to concentrate on my movie, I quietly made my way to the basement door and pressed my ear against the wood. What I heard made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Michael was talking to someone, his voice low but clearly audible through the thin door. But we didn't have a landline in the basement, and cell phone service was spotty down there. Who could he possibly be talking to? As I listened more carefully, I realized with growing horror that he wasn't talking to someone. He was talking to something, a recording device of some kind, speaking in the measured tone of someone dictating important information. Entry for June 25th, 2021. Michael's voice drifted up from below. The timeline needs to be moved up. Sarah's getting too suspicious, asking too many questions. I can't keep deflecting much longer without arousing more suspicion than I already have. My legs felt like they were going to collapse underneath me. Sarah, that was me. My husband was making recordings about me, about keeping something secret from me, about a timeline that involved my growing suspicion. The room began to spin as I tried to process what I was hearing. The missing photos and personal items are working as planned, Michael continued. She's starting to doubt her own memory, which will make the transition easier when the time comes. Patricia thinks we should wait until the anniversary, but I'm not sure we can maintain the charade that long. She's not stupid, and she's starting to piece things together. Patricia, his mother. His mother was involved in whatever this was, whatever plan they were executing that required making me doubt my own memory. I gripped the doorframe to steady myself, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid Michael might hear it through the floor. The insurance documentation is almost complete. Michael's voice continued. Robert found a doctor willing to backdate the medical records so that part of the story should hold up under scrutiny. Carmen's been practicing the grief counselor role, and she's gotten quite good at it. She'll be ready when we need her to step in. Insurance documentation, backdated medical records, Carmen practicing a role as a grief counselor. The words swirled around in my mind like a tornado, picking up pieces of the last several months and rearranging them into a pattern I couldn't yet comprehend, but knew was devastating. The hardest part will be the actual event, Michael said, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, cold, calculating, completely devoid of the warmth I'd fallen in love with 3 years ago. It has to look natural, accidental. Sarah can't suspect anything until after it's over, until after she's collected the insurance money, and we can access it through the beneficiary arrangements we've set up. The actual event, the insurance money, beneficiary arrangements. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly snapped together in my mind with the force of a physical blow. They weren't just hiding something from me, they were planning something that involved my death, my insurance money, and an elaborate charade designed to make it look natural. I stumbled backward from the door, my hand clamped over my mouth to muffle the sob that was trying to escape. The man I'd married, the man I'd trusted with my life and my future, was downstairs planning my murder with his family's help. The late nights at work, the secretive phone calls, the missing photographs, it had all been preparation for killing me and collecting the insurance money. The recording of Michael's voice continued, but I couldn't listen anymore. I ran to our bedroom, my mind racing with the impossibility of what I'd just learned. How long had they been planning this? How long had Michael been lying next to me at night, knowing he intended to kill me? How long had Patricia and Robert and Carmen been smiling at family dinners while plotting my death? I spent that night sitting in my car in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner, too afraid to go home and too shocked to think clearly. Every memory of the past few months took on a sinister new meaning. The rules about not answering the door weren't for my safety. They were to control who I talked to, who might ask questions if I disappeared. The missing photographs weren't random losses. They were evidence being eliminated, traces of my existence being systematically erased. The next morning, I returned home to find Michael making breakfast as if nothing had happened, humming off-key Beatles songs like the loving husband I'd thought he was. He kissed my forehead and asked if I'd slept well, his performance of normalcy so complete that for a moment I wondered if I'd imagined the entire basement conversation. But I hadn't imagined it, and over the next few weeks, I became a detective in my own home. I started documenting every strange conversation, every unexplained absence, every new rule or restriction. I purchased a small recording device and began secretly taping Michael's phone calls, trying to gather evidence of the conspiracy I knew was unfolding around me. What I discovered was worse than anything I could have imagined. The insurance policy on my life had been increased to $500,000 just 6 months after we were married, a change I'd signed without reading carefully because I trusted my husband completely. The beneficiary was listed as Michael, but there was a secondary clause I'd missed. If Michael died before me, the money would go to a trust managed by his parents. If I died while married to Michael, he would collect the full amount, but there was a provision that if we divorced, the policy would be voided. The medical records Michael had mentioned were being falsified to show that I had a previously undiagnosed heart condition, something that would explain a sudden cardiac event. I found copies of these fake medical files hidden in Michael's briefcase, complete with forged signatures from doctors I'd never seen and test results for procedures I'd never undergone. The most chilling discovery was a detailed timeline, written in Michael's handwriting, outlining exactly how my death would be staged. It would happen on our 3rd wedding anniversary, during a romantic weekend getaway to a cabin in the mountains. I would have a heart attack while hiking, too far from help for anyone to save me. Michael would call 911 in apparent panic. Carmen would arrive as a grief counselor to help him cope, and the insurance money would be collected within a few months. But knowing about the plan and proving it were two different things. I couldn't go to the police with my secretly recorded conversations and stolen documents. I'd obtained them illegally, and without corroborating evidence, it would be my word against an entire family's. I needed something more, something that would expose their conspiracy in a way that couldn't be denied or explained away. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Henderson, our 78-year-old neighbor, knocked on my door on a sunny Tuesday afternoon in August, carrying a plate of homemade cookies and a concerned expression. "Sarah, dear, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I've been worried about you," she said as I invited her into the living room. "You've seemed so tense lately, and I couldn't help but notice some strange activity around your house at odd hours." Mrs. Henderson had been living next door for 35 years, and she spent most of her retirement gardening and keeping a casual watch on the neighborhood. What she'd observed over the past few months sent chills down my spine. "There was a van parked across the street last Thursday night around midnight," she said, her voice low as if she were afraid of being overheard. "Two men got out and spent about an hour near your house, looking at the windows and walking around the yard. When I turned on my porch light, they left quickly." "Did you recognize them?" I asked, though I already suspected I knew the answer. "Well, that's the strange thing," Mrs. Henderson said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "One of them looked an awful lot like your father-in-law, Robert, but I couldn't imagine why he'd be creeping around your property in the middle of the night instead of just knocking on the door." The surveillance had extended beyond the family. They were watching my house, studying my routines, planning the perfect time and method for carrying out their plan. Mrs. Henderson's observations confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. This wasn't a hastily conceived scheme, but a carefully orchestrated conspiracy that had been months in the making. "There's something else," Mrs. Henderson continued, her weathered hands wringing together nervously. "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I overheard your husband on his cell phone in your backyard last week. He was talking about someone named Sarah, and he didn't sound like the loving husband I've always thought he was." She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with sharing what she'd heard, but her concern for my well-being overcame her reluctance to get involved in someone else's business. "He said something about making it look natural, and no one will question a heart attack. Sarah, I've lived long enough to recognize when something isn't right, and whatever your husband is planning, I don't think it's in your best interest." Mrs. Henderson's validation gave me the courage I needed to take action. If a neighbor with no stake in my marriage could see that something was wrong, then I wasn't being paranoid or delusional. I was in real danger, and I needed to find a way to expose the truth before their timeline reached its conclusion. That night, while Michael was supposedly working late again, I broke into the basement. The lock was stronger than I'd expected, but desperation gave me the persistence to work at it with a hairpin and a small screwdriver until it finally clicked open. The basement that was supposed to be my office had been transformed into something that looked like a command center for a military operation. Filing cabinets lined one wall, filled with documents that detailed every aspect of the plan to kill me. There were copies of insurance policies, forged medical records, character references for Michael's supposed grief, and even newspaper clippings about other accidental deaths that they'd apparently studied for inspiration. A corkboard on the far wall displayed a map of the mountain cabin where they planned to murder me, with hiking trails marked and distances to the nearest hospital calculated. But the most devastating discovery was sitting on a desk in the corner of the room, a professional-grade recording device, still running, with dozens of microcassettes stored in an organized filing system. Each tape was labeled with a date and brief description: Sarah's daily routine, insurance company protocols, police response times, medical examiner procedures. I found the tape from the night I'd overheard Michael's dictation, but as I continued searching, I realized there were recordings going back almost to the beginning of our marriage. They'd been documenting my habits, my friendships, my work schedule, my health, creating a comprehensive profile that would help them plan the perfect murder. One tape was labeled simply "Backup Plan," and when I played it, Michael's voice filled the basement with words that made my soul feel like it was being ripped apart. "If the heart attack scenario doesn't work, we'll have to consider alternatives," he said in that same cold, calculating tone I'd heard before. "Patricia thinks a car accident might be more believable, something that happens on Sarah's drive home from work. The life insurance pays out the same regardless of cause of death, as long as it appears accidental. The important thing," Michael's voice continued, "is that Sarah never suspects what's really happening. She has to believe right up until the end that I love her, that we have a future together. The insurance company will investigate more thoroughly if there's any evidence of marital problems or if she seemed afraid or suspicious before her death." I had to stop the tape. Hearing the man I'd married discussing the best method for killing me while maintaining the pretense of loving me was more than my heart could bear. I sat on the cold basement floor and cried until my chest ached, grieving not just for the danger I was in, but for the death of the love I'd thought was real. But grief would have to wait. I copied every tape in that basement, every document in those filing cabinets, every piece of evidence that proved my husband and his family were planning to murder me for insurance money. I worked until dawn, photographing and recording and documenting everything I could find, building a case that would expose their conspiracy even if I didn't survive to present it myself. The next few days were the most terrifying of my life. I had to continue living with Michael, pretending that nothing had changed, maintaining the loving wife act while knowing that he was planning to kill me. Every kiss felt like betrayal. Every "I love you" felt like mockery. Every moment alone with him felt like it might be my last. But I had a plan now, too. I reached out to a lawyer friend from college, someone Michael had never met, and arranged to meet her at a coffee shop across town. Lisa Chang had become a successful attorney specializing in family law and insurance fraud, and when I showed her the evidence I'd gathered, her professional composure cracked. "Sarah, this is unbelievable," she said, scrolling through the photographs of forged medical records on my phone. "This isn't just attempted murder. This is an elaborate insurance fraud scheme involving multiple people and months of planning. We need to get you somewhere safe immediately." "But will the evidence hold up in court?" I asked, my hands shaking as I gripped my coffee cup. "I obtained it illegally, by breaking into my own basement and recording conversations without consent." Lisa was quiet for a long moment, reviewing the legal implications of my situation. Finally, she looked up with a grim expression. "The evidence you gathered illegally won't be admissible in criminal court," she said carefully, "but it gives us enough information to involve law enforcement in a way that will allow them to gather legitimate evidence. And there's something else. If we can get Michael or his family to admit to the conspiracy in a controlled environment, with proper recording equipment and legal authority, that would be admissible." "How would we do that?" I asked, though I was already beginning to understand what she was suggesting. "We set up a sting operation," Lisa said. "With the help of local police, we create a situation where Michael feels comfortable discussing the plan, where he believes he's safe from surveillance. Then we record everything legally, with proper warrants and official oversight." The plan Lisa outlined was both simple and terrifying. I would wear a wire and arrange a family meeting to discuss our anniversary plans, the same anniversary weekend when they intended to kill me. If I could get them talking about the cabin, about the hiking trip, about any aspect of their plan, it would provide law enforcement with the evidence they needed to make arrests. But first, we had to approach the police with our allegations and convince them that the conspiracy was real despite the illegal way I'd discovered it. That meeting took place on a Thursday afternoon in late August, in a small conference room at the local police station that smelled like stale coffee and industrial disinfectant. Detective Maria Santos listened to my story with the kind of professional skepticism I'd expected, her dark eyes never leaving my face as I explained about the basement recordings and the forged medical documents. Lisa had coached me to stick to facts rather than emotions, to present the evidence methodically rather than reactively, but I could hear my voice shaking as I described the months of surveillance and planning. "These are serious allegations, Mrs. Williams," Detective Santos said when I finished my presentation. "If what you're telling us is true, your husband and his family are planning to commit murder for financial gain. But I have to be honest, the evidence you've gathered isn't something we can use in court." "We understand that," Lisa interjected. "But surely the pattern of behavior Sarah has documented, combined with the specific details in those basement recordings, provides enough probable cause for further investigation?" Detective Santos reviewed the photographs I'd taken, listening to snippets of the recorded conversations through headphones I'd brought. Her expression grew more serious as she absorbed the scope of the conspiracy. "The level of planning here is extraordinary," she admitted. "This isn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous decision. This is premeditated murder with an elaborate cover-up already in place. If we're going to stop this, we need to move quickly and carefully." The plan we developed involved cooperation between local police, state insurance investigators, and federal authorities who specialized in insurance fraud cases. I would return home and act normally while wearing a sophisticated recording device, continuing my regular routine until the planned family meeting, where they hoped to finalize details for the anniversary trip. The wire I wore was smaller than I'd expected, a device no bigger than a button that could be concealed under my clothing and would transmit everything to police monitoring equipment parked half a mile from my house. For 3 days, I lived my normal life while secretly recording every conversation with Michael, waiting for the right moment to spring our trap. That moment came on Sunday afternoon, when Patricia called to invite us over for dinner to discuss our anniversary celebration. The timing was perfect. According to the timeline I'd found in Michael's basement files, They needed to finalize their plans within the next week to stay on schedule for the September murder. As we drove to his parents' house, Michael seemed more relaxed than he'd been in months. He hummed along to the radio and talked about looking forward to our romantic getaway, playing his role of loving husband with an enthusiasm that made me feel physically sick. He had no idea that every word he spoke was being transmitted to law enforcement officers who were finally taking my situation seriously. The dinner at Patricia and Robert's house began normally enough. Carmen was there with her boyfriend, a man named David, who seemed uncomfortable with the family dynamic, but tried to make polite conversation. Patricia served roast chicken with all the traditional sides, and Robert opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving for a special occasion. To any outside observer, we looked like a normal family gathering to celebrate an upcoming anniversary. But as the evening progressed and the wine flowed more freely, the conversation began to shift toward the topics I'd been dreading and hoping for simultaneously. "So, have you two decided what you want to do for your anniversary weekend?" Patricia asked, her voice carrying that artificially sweet tone I'd learned to recognize as dangerous. "We were thinking about that cabin Michael found up in the mountains," I said, following the script Lisa and Detective Santos had helped me prepare. "It sounds so romantic and secluded." "Oh, that place is perfect for a romantic getaway," Carmen chimed in, her voice a little too enthusiastic. "Completely private, miles from the nearest neighbor. You'll have the mountain all to yourselves." Michael squeezed my hand under the table, and I had to fight to keep my expression loving rather than terrified. He was probably thinking about how perfectly isolated we would be, how no one would hear me scream when they carried out their plan. "I've already made reservations for Friday through Sunday," Michael said. 3 days of hiking, relaxing by the fire, just enjoying each other's company. It's exactly what we need after all the stress of the past few months. Robert raised his wine glass in a toast, to Sarah and Michael, and to the future they're building together. The irony of that toast, celebrating a future they were planning to destroy, was almost too much for me to bear. But I lifted my glass and smiled, playing my part in their charade while the recording device captured every word. As the evening continued, they became increasingly comfortable discussing details that confirmed everything I'd discovered in the basement. Carmen mentioned a hiking trail that was particularly challenging and far from any cell phone towers. Robert talked about the importance of having emergency medical information readily available, just in case something unexpected happens in such a remote location. But it was Patricia who provided the most damning evidence, her words carrying the weight of months of planning and malicious intent. "I've been doing research on heart conditions," she said, her voice casual as if she were discussing a hobby rather than murder. "Did you know that sudden cardiac events are much more common at high altitude? The reduced oxygen can put tremendous stress on the cardiovascular system, especially in someone with an undiagnosed condition." She looked directly at me as she spoke, her eyes cold and calculating in a way that made my blood freeze. "Sarah, you've never had your heart checked thoroughly, have you? No stress tests or detailed cardiac workups?" "No, I don't think so," I replied, my voice barely steady. "Should I be worried about something?" "Oh, probably not," Patricia said with false reassurance. "It's just that these mountain hiking trips can be more strenuous than people expect. It would be terrible if someone had an undiagnosed heart problem and experienced complications so far from medical help." The recording device was capturing every word of this conversation, building a legal case that would eventually bring justice for the months of terror they'd put me through. But sitting in that dining room, surrounded by people who were calmly discussing the best way to murder me, I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare from which I might never wake up. The evening's most shocking revelation came when Michael excused himself to use the bathroom, and Patricia leaned across the table toward me with a grandmother's concerned expression. "Sarah, dear, I want you to know that no matter what happens, we'll always consider you family," she said, patting my hand with what would have seemed like genuine affection if I hadn't known her true intentions. "If anything ever happened to Michael, we'd make sure you were taken care of. And if anything ever happened to you, well, we'd make sure Michael was taken care of too." The subtext was clear. Whether I died first or Michael died first, the family had plans to benefit financially. The insurance policy I'd discovered was just one piece of a larger scheme designed to enrich them regardless of which spouse died under tragic circumstances. When Michael returned from the bathroom, the conversation shifted back to safer topics: work, weather, neighborhood gossip. But the damage had been done. The recording device had captured more than enough evidence to prove that the Williams family was actively planning to commit murder for insurance money. As we prepared to leave, Carmen hugged me goodbye with what felt like genuine emotion, and for a moment, I wondered if she had any reservations about the plan she'd agreed to participate in. But then she whispered in my ear, "I hope you have a wonderful anniversary weekend. It's going to be a trip you'll never forget." The drive home was silent, except for the radio and Michael's occasional humming. He seemed satisfied with how the evening had gone, probably confident that all the pieces were falling into place for the perfect murder. I stared out the passenger window at the familiar streets of our neighborhood, wondering if I would ever feel safe in this place again. That night, as Michael slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and processing the full scope of what I'd learned. This wasn't just a husband planning to kill his wife for money. This was an entire family conspiracy involving falsified medical records, staged accidents, and months of psychological manipulation designed to make me doubt my own instincts. The psychological toll of living with this knowledge was devastating. Every normal interaction with Michael felt like a performance. Every kiss goodnight felt like betrayal. Every "I love you" felt like mockery. I was grieving the death of my marriage while simultaneously fighting for my life, mourning the man I'd thought I married while gathering evidence against the monster he'd revealed himself to be. The next morning, Detective Santos called to confirm that the recording equipment had captured everything clearly and that they had enough evidence to move forward with arrests. The plan was to take Michael and his family into custody on Thursday morning, 2 days before our scheduled anniversary trip to the mountains. But Michael had plans of his own. Tuesday night, he came home from work with an expression I'd never seen before, excitement mixed with something darker that made my skin crawl. He was carrying a small overnight bag and had the kind of energy that suggested major changes were coming. "Sarah, I have a surprise for you," he said, his voice bright with manufactured enthusiasm. "I know our anniversary isn't until Friday, but I thought we could leave early. Take a long weekend, really make it special." My heart started racing as I realized what this meant. They were moving up their timeline, probably because they suspected something or simply couldn't wait any longer to carry out their plan. The police weren't prepared for early arrests, and I wasn't sure the recording equipment would work properly in the remote mountain location where they intended to kill me. "That sounds wonderful," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "But shouldn't we plan a little more? Make sure we have everything we need for an extended trip." "I've already taken care of everything," Michael replied, his smile never wavering. "Packed your hiking boots, your warm clothes, even that granola you like for trail snacks. All you need to do is grab your toiletries and we can leave first thing in the morning." The trap was closing around me faster than anyone had anticipated. I excused myself to use the bathroom and quickly sent a text message to the emergency number Detective Santos had given me. Timeline moved up, leaving for cabin tomorrow morning. Need help now. The response came back within minutes. Understood. Backup plan in effect. Trust the process. That night was the longest of my life. I lay in bed next to Michael, knowing it would probably be our last night in the house where I'd once been happy, listening to him breathe peacefully while I planned for what might be my final day alive. The man who had promised to love and protect me until death do us part was planning to make sure that death came much sooner than either of us had vowed. Wednesday morning dawned gray and drizzly, with the kind of persistent rain that makes everything feel ominous and uncertain. Michael was up early, loading our car with supplies that looked innocent, but took on sinister meaning when I considered their true purpose. The hiking boots he'd packed for me were a size too small, probably to ensure I'd be uncomfortable and slow on the trail. The first aid kit was conspicuously lacking in heart medication, despite the cardiac emergency they were planning to stage. As we drove out of our neighborhood, I took what I thought might be my last look at Mrs. Henderson's garden, at the mailbox where I'd received love letters from Michael during our courtship, at the street signs that had guided me home every day for the past 3 years. Everything looked the same, but I felt like I was leaving behind not just my house, but my entire identity as a woman who trusted the people she loved. The drive to the mountain cabin took 4 hours, through increasingly remote countryside that gradually transformed from suburban developments to rural farmland to dense forest. Michael chatted enthusiastically about our romantic weekend plans, pointing out scenic overlooks and wildlife as if we were actually going on the honeymoon getaway he was pretending to plan. But as the cell phone towers disappeared and the radio stations faded to static, I began to understand how carefully they'd chosen this location. We were entering an area where communication would be impossible, where help was hours away, where a woman's screams would be heard by no one but the trees. The cabin itself was smaller than I'd expected, a rustic log structure that looked charming in the photographs but felt isolated and vulnerable in reality. It sat in a clearing surrounded by dense pine forest, with no visible neighbors and no cell phone service. The nearest town was 30 miles away down a winding mountain road, and the nearest hospital was even farther. "Isn't it perfect?" Michael said as he unloaded our bags. "Complete privacy, total seclusion. No phones, no internet, no distractions, just you and me and all the time in the world." He carried our bags inside while I stood in the clearing, looking up at the mountains that towered around us like walls of a natural prison. The silence was absolute, except for the wind in the trees and the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. If Detective Santos and her team were going to save me, they were running out of time. That evening, as we sat by the fireplace eating a dinner Michael had prepared with suspicious enthusiasm, I realized that tomorrow would be the day they'd chosen to kill me. Michael kept checking his watch and glancing out the windows as if he were waiting for something or someone. The performance of romantic husband was becoming harder for him to maintain, and I could see flashes of the cold, calculating man I'd heard on those basement recordings. "I thought we'd go for a hike tomorrow," he said as he poured wine that I pretended to drink but didn't dare consume. "There's a beautiful trail that leads to a waterfall about 3 miles from here. It's supposed to be spectacular this time of year. 3 miles from the cabin, on a trail where my body wouldn't be found quickly, where the staged heart attack would have time to become convincing before anyone discovered me." I nodded and smiled, playing the loving wife role while my mind raced through possible escape scenarios. "That sounds perfect," I said. "I can't wait to see the waterfall with you." But I had no intention of hiking anywhere with Michael Williams. As he cleaned up the dinner dishes, humming those same off-key Beatles songs that had once charmed me, I was finalizing my own plan for survival. The recording device I wore was sophisticated enough to transmit over longer distances than typical equipment, and Detective Santos had assured me that they had tracking capabilities that would work even in remote locations. If Michael was planning to kill me tomorrow, law enforcement would be prepared to intervene. But as I lay in the cabin's small bedroom that night, listening to Michael's steady breathing beside me, I wasn't sure that help would arrive in time. The mountains were vast, the trails were numerous, and if something went wrong with the tracking equipment, I would be entirely on my own with a man who had spent months planning my death. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp mountain air that should have been invigorating, but instead felt like a countdown to disaster. Michael was up early, preparing trail mix and filling water bottles with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed these actions many times. His movements were different now, more purposeful, less performative, as if the need to maintain his loving husband act was coming to an end. "Ready for our big adventure?" he asked, as he shouldered his hiking backpack. "I can't wait," I replied, though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run in the opposite direction. We left the cabin just after 8 o'clock, following a trail that led deeper into the forest with every step. Michael walked slightly ahead of me, consulting a map that he claimed would guide us to the waterfall, but that I suspected would lead us to the perfect spot for staging an accidental death. The forest was beautiful in an ominous way, with towering pine trees that blocked most of the morning sunlight and created a cathedral-like silence broken only by our footsteps on the pine needle carpet. Birds called from somewhere high in the canopy, and I caught glimpses of squirrels and chipmunks watching our progress with curious eyes. After about an hour of hiking, Michael stopped at a clearing that offered a view of the valley below. "This is perfect," he said, though we were nowhere near any waterfall. "Let's take a break here and enjoy the view." I knew this was the moment I'd been dreading. This was the isolated spot where they'd planned to stage my heart attack, far enough from the cabin that my screams wouldn't be heard, remote enough that help couldn't arrive in time even if someone called for it. But as Michael reached into his backpack for what I was certain would be the weapon or drug they'd planned to use, the forest around us suddenly came alive with sounds that had nothing to do with nature. "Police! Drop your weapons and put your hands where we can see them!" The voice boomed through the trees with an authority that made both Michael and me freeze in place. Within seconds, the clearing was filled with law enforcement officers wearing tactical gear and carrying weapons that were definitely not hiking equipment. Michael's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally a rage so pure and venomous that I barely recognized him as the man I'd married. He looked at me with an expression that made it clear he knew I was responsible for the police presence, that his carefully planned murder had been transformed into his own arrest. "You recorded us," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "You've been recording us all along." "Yes," I said, my voice stronger than I'd felt in months. "I recorded every conversation, every plan, every detail of what you and your family intended to do to me." Detective Santos emerged from behind a cluster of pine trees, her weapon drawn but pointed at the ground. "Michael Williams, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and attempted homicide. You have the right to remain silent." As she read him his rights, other officers were securing the area and documenting evidence that would be used in the trial. Michael's backpack contained a syringe filled with a substance that would have simulated a heart attack, along with forged emergency medical documents that would have supported the cardiac event story. But the most satisfying moment came when Detective Santos played the recording of our dinner conversation at his parents' house. Michael's own voice filling the forest clearing as he discussed the best altitude for staging an accidental cardiac emergency. "The recording device you've been wearing for the past week captured everything," Detective Santos explained as Michael was led away in handcuffs. "Your husband's family was arrested this morning at their home, where we found extensive evidence of the conspiracy, including the basement command center you told us about." The ride down the mountain felt like being reborn. With every mile we put between ourselves and the cabin where I was supposed to die, I felt pieces of my real life returning. The fear that had consumed me for months was finally lifting, replaced by a complicated mixture of relief, grief, and something that felt almost like triumph. The trial took place 8 months later, in a courthouse that filled with media attention from across the country. The story of a woman who secretly recorded her husband's family planning her murder captured national headlines, and the evidence we'd gathered became the centerpiece of a prosecution case that would send all 4 conspirators to prison for decades. Michael's defense attorney tried to argue that the recordings were taken out of context, that the conversations about my death were hypothetical discussions rather than actual plans. But the basement command center, the forged medical records, the falsified insurance documents, and the syringe full of cardiac simulation drugs made their intentions impossible to deny. Patricia Williams received 15 years for conspiracy to commit murder and insurance fraud. Robert Williams received 12 years for his role in forging medical documents and conducting surveillance. Carmen Williams received 10 years for conspiracy and for her planned role as a grief counselor designed to help Michael collect the insurance money more quickly. Michael himself received life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that felt both satisfying and heartbreaking. The man who had once promised to love me until death do us part would now spend the rest of his life in a prison cell, paying for his decision to prioritize money over the woman he'd vowed to protect. But perhaps the most important moment of the trial came when I took the stand to read my victim impact statement, speaking directly to the courtroom full of people who had followed our story with fascination and horror. "For months, I believed that I was losing my mind," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "The man I trusted most in the world was systematically convincing me that my memories were wrong, that my instincts were unreliable, that my growing fear was simply paranoia. I want other women to know that if something feels wrong in your marriage, if you notice changes in your partner that don't make sense, if you find yourself questioning your own sanity because the person you love is telling you that up is down and black is white, trust yourself. Your instincts are trying to protect you, and you deserve to listen to them." The courtroom was silent as I continued, sharing the details of how the conspiracy had unfolded and how close it had come to succeeding. This case isn't just about attempted murder, it's about the way abusers use gaslighting and manipulation to make their victims doubt their own reality. It's about the importance of trusting women when they say something is wrong, even if they can't immediately prove it. When the trial ended and the sentences were handed down, I felt a closure that I hadn't expected to be possible. possible. Justice had been served, not just for the attempt on my life, but for the months of psychological torture that had preceded it. The people who had pretended to love me while planning my death were finally facing consequences for their actions. But justice, I discovered, was only the beginning of my healing process. The woman who emerged from that courtroom was fundamentally different from the trusting wife who had met Michael in a bookstore cafe 4 years earlier. I had learned that love could be faked with devastating effectiveness, that family bonds could conceal the most malicious intentions, that the people who promise to protect you can sometimes be the ones you most need protection from. The house Michael and I had shared became impossible to live in once I knew about the basement command center and the months of surveillance I'd endured there. I sold it and moved across the country to a small coastal town in Oregon where nobody knew my story, and I could begin rebuilding my identity as something other than a victim. The insurance money that Michael had planned to steal after my death became the foundation for a new life I never could have imagined. I used it to start a nonprofit organization that helps women who are experiencing psychological abuse, providing resources for recognizing gaslighting, documenting evidence of manipulation, and safely escaping from dangerous relationships. The work is deeply personal and sometimes triggering, but it feels like the most meaningful thing I've ever done. Every woman who calls our hotline, every survivor who finds the courage to trust her instincts despite being told she's crazy, every case where we help gather evidence that leads to justice, it all feels connected to that terrifying year when I learned that the person who claimed to love me most was actually my greatest enemy. I never remarried, though I've had relationships with men who understand that trust is something that must be earned slowly and carefully. The part of me that believed in fairy tale romance died in that basement when I first heard Michael's voice discussing the best way to kill me. But the part of me that believes in my own strength, my own instincts, my own worth, that part grew stronger than it had ever been before. Sometimes, late at night in my cottage by the ocean, I think about the alternative timeline where I never found those basement recordings, never discovered the truth about my husband's intentions. In that timeline, I would have died on a mountain trail 3 years ago, my death attributed to an undiagnosed heart condition, my murder successfully disguised as natural causes. Michael would have collected the insurance money, probably remarried within a year or two, and Patricia would have gotten away with her role in planning my death. The story would have been forgotten by everyone, except the people who profited from my supposed accident. But I didn't die on that mountain trail. I lived and fought and survived and transformed my experience into something that helps other women recognize when their own lives might be in danger. The tape that Michael never expected me to hear became the tool that exposed his entire conspiracy and saved not just my life, but potentially the lives of future victims. The recording device that captured his family's dinner conversation, the basement tapes that documented months of planning, the evidence that proved their intentions beyond any doubt, all of it started with a woman who trusted her instincts enough to investigate when something felt wrong. They mocked me for asking questions about my dead husband, except my husband wasn't dead yet, and the mockery turned to stunned silence when that tape started playing, and their own voices filled the courtroom with confessions they never intended anyone to hear. Today, I wake up every morning in a house where I feel safe, in a life I built entirely on my own terms, surrounded by work that gives meaning to even the darkest chapters of my experience. The woman who once doubted her own memories now helps other women trust their instincts. The victim who was told she was paranoid now teaches others that hypervigilance can be a survival skill. And sometimes, when I'm helping a woman who calls our hotline because something feels wrong in her marriage but she can't prove it, I think about how different all our lives might have been if I hadn't pressed my ear to that basement door on a humid night in June and heard my husband planning my murder. The truth saved my life. But more than that, it gave me a life worth saving, one built on authenticity rather than performance, on genuine connections rather than manipulative control, on the hard-won knowledge that I can trust myself even when the people closest to me are determined to convince me otherwise. They thought they were planning the perfect murder. Instead, they created the perfect survivor.